This morning we are continuing in a series we started early in the summer called Bible Stories That Don't Grow Old. And this morning we're talking about the need to count on God's promises. We're going to be looking at really just two verses in Hebrews chapter 11. I'm going to read three because it helps us to tie these Bible stories together. And this is, we're going to be in Hebrews 11, 20 through 22. This is the seventh in our summer series called Bible Stories That Don't Grow Old. We've heard of these people all our lives. We've learned about them in Sunday school and in vacation Bible school, at church camp. The names have been thrown around. They have been used as illustrations in Bible lessons and in sermons. But these were real people who had real issues and real concerns. And so far this summer, we've looked at 6 Old Testament people who were honored for their faith. These people are mentioned in the 11th chapter of the New Testament book of Hebrews, which is often called the roll call of faith, because here we have all these Old Testament Bible characters who became Bible heroes. And we find ourselves reviewing who they were and what they did. And there is one common denominator among them all. They were people of faith. And so last week we talked about Abraham and we talked about his son Isaac. And today we are jumping ahead. We are going to look at the profound influence that Isaac's grandson Joseph had. And for that, let's just turn to Hebrews chapter 11. If you look at verse 19, it says, speaking of the sacrifice that Abraham was willing to make and the sacrifice that Isaac was willing to be, Hebrews 11:19 says, Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death, because he was willing to do what God told him to do. He was entrusting everything he had into God's wisdom, even though it didn't make sense to him. And then the Hebrew writer kind of skims over a few of these Bible characters that we've heard of all our lives because he wants to focus on one especially. In verse 20, he said, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future, and then by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshiped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions for his bones. These people lived by faith. They could not see what was yet ahead, but they knew that God was in the future, and that they also knew they needed to do what they could and should do to be able to promote what God was expecting. And so with these, we have looked at some of their anguished times. We have looked at some of the times when they have been uncertain of what God was asking for, but yet they obeyed. And we've all heard of people measuring someone's IQ, their intelligence quotient. But did you know that there are serious attempts to determine an AQ? Not an IQ, but an AQ. And an AQ is an adversity quotient. An adversity quotient is a score that gauges a person's ability to deal with the adversities in their life. We all have adversities. We all have trouble. We all have unexpected difficulties that rear up and face us and try to stomp us down. How do we deal with them? Do we surrender to them? Or do we stand up against them and trust God? Had Joseph taken an AQ test, he would have passed with flying colors. Now, let's not mistake the Joseph of the Old Testament with the Joseph of the New Testament. Two completely different Bible characters. Joseph of the Old Testament his story was found in the book of Genesis. Joseph of the New Testament is found in the Gospels as the stepfather of Jesus Christ. Two different men, godly men, with the same name, but two different directions for what God expected them to do. Hebrews 11 only mentions Joseph when Jacob blessed his two sons, and it only mentions Joseph when it is said that he made plans for his bones to be carried back to the promised land when Israel would leave Egypt. And that was it. That's not much of a story, is it? But there's so much more of the story of Joseph's life, than what is emphasized in the 11th chapter of Hebrews. We find Joseph's story in the book of Genesis. In fact, we find Joseph's story dramatically taking over the book of Genesis at the end of the book. 26% of the entire book of Genesis. 13 of its 50 chapters are devoted to Joseph and to his story. In Hebrews 11, we see that his sons were blessed by his father, and we see that he gave directions for his bones. That's not much to go on, so let's dig a little bit deeper. Let's understand that if there was anyone who faced adversity, if there was anyone who had to overcome, it was Joseph. And so despite the troubles that Joseph faced, he got through those troubles by counting on the promises of God. And he had trouble in three main parts of his life. First of all, Joseph had trouble with his family. Now, dysfunctional families that don't work well together, have always been around, and they are found throughout the Bible. But Joseph grew up in what had to be one of the most dysfunctional families in the Old Testament. His father, Jacob, had 4 wives at the same time. And Joseph's mother, Rachel, was his father's favorite wives, and the other 3 knew it. You talk about dysfunction. Not just did the other 3 knew it, but their kids all knew it. Rachel died while giving birth to Joseph's younger brother, Benjamin. And there was grief for Joseph. There was grief for Jacob. Jacob was really overindulgent in his care for the people he really cared for. He played favorites with his children. And that's not healthy, but yet he did. Because Joseph was the child from his favored wife, he overindulged on him. He showed favoritism, and that really irritated the rest of the brothers. Jacob showered Joseph with attention, with extravagant gifts. Well, the one we know the most of is the coat of many colors. The coat of many colors. Joseph, I want you to know how special you are, so I'm giving you a coat that none of your brothers or none of your sisters will ever have. It's going to identify you as my favorite son. What's this about this kid brother of ours? His 10 half-brothers were extremely jealous of Joseph's favorite status. And because Jacob did not understand the depth of his other sons' hatred towards Joseph, it really opened up a door for Joseph to be exploited and for Joseph to be abused by his older brothers. There were 3 main things that fueled Joseph's brothers' hatred. First was that special coat, the coat of many colors that we hear about. There was a rock musical a few decades ago, Joseph's Amazing Technicolor, coat. And some of us maybe have seen it, some of us remember it. You might recognize some of the tunes from it, but it was a source of contention. But Joseph had a problem that caused his brothers to be angry at him. We are told that Joseph regularly and constantly tattled on his brothers. Don't you love a tattletale brother or sister? You do something, and you're supposed to keep it quiet. Oh, I'm going to keep it quiet. Mom, Dad, did you know what? That's what Joseph was like. He had a problem that way. But Joseph also, even as a teen, was given the ability to dream dreams. He was given the ability to understand dreams, and that came in handy, not just handy, but that was crucial to the success of the nation of Israel when Joseph became the interpreter of dreams for Pharaoh. But early on, he had a dream, had two dreams in fact, where he told his brothers how they would eventually bow before him, and that just dug into their craw. That just made them angry. And so, one day while Joseph's 10 older brothers were grazing their father's flocks near the community of Shechem, Jacob sent Joseph to see how they were doing, to take some provisions to them. And Joseph began to search the pasture fields that he thought his brothers would be in, and he didn't spot them. But he found a man there who directed them farther north to the area of Dothan. And so Joseph continued this long walk. And as Joseph approached, the brothers recognized him. How could they not recognize him? He in that blasted coat of many colors. You could see that from a mile away. Everyone knew who Joseph was because he wore that coat. It was his gift from his dad. It identified his favoritism with his father, and it just angered the brothers. And so they were fed up. And they said, we got to put an end to this. Let's kill him. Let's kill him, and we can make this dreamer quiet once and for all. But Reuben, one of the oldest, was really against that. Reuben had a soft spot in his heart for his kid brother Joseph. And so he begged his other brothers not to follow through with that plan. He said, look, if we're going to try to get rid of Joseph, let's not kill him. Let's not shed the blood of a family member, but let's just throw him into a cistern and leave him there. Eventually, he'll die, and it won't be our blood on his hands. Reuben really was hoping that when his brothers had left and taken the flocks elsewhere, he would circle back around and he would lift Joseph up from that cistern and rescue him. And so, that's what he thought. And when the plan came about, it turned out that Reuben was not with the other brothers. And these other brothers, the 9, stripped Joseph of his special coat. And they did. They threw him into an empty cistern. And there, sitting around the cistern, ignoring Joseph's cries for help, they sat down for lunch. Could have been one of the meals that Joseph had brought to them from their father. They didn't care. They were going to be rid of this kid once and for all. And during the meal, they spotted a caravan of Midianite merchants, men from Midian who were salespeople. And they were traveling on their way to Egypt. And Judah had an idea. Judah said, hey, fellas, he said, rather than us kill our own flesh and blood, rather than just let him stay in this dry cistern and die, why don't we make a little money out of this? Why don't we sell Joseph to these Midianite merchants, and they can do whatever they want with him? And the rest of them thought that was a good idea. And so they sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver, and he was taken by the Midianites to Egypt. 20 pieces of silver, 30 pieces of silver. A similarity there, isn't there? And so now Joseph was on his way to Egypt. Now Reuben, when he came back, he was really upset because the brothers weren't there and Joseph wasn't in the cistern. He was missing. So now what was he going to tell his father? And so he talked to the brothers and came up with a scheme that would conceal their crime. They killed a goat. And they dipped Joseph's robe, his coat of many colors, into the goat's blood. And they took that bloody coat back to Jacob and asked, can you identify this, Dad? Do you recognize this? We found this out in the field. And maybe this is why Joseph didn't come home. And they didn't say anything different. They allowed Jacob to jump to his own conclusion that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal, and Jacob was irreconcilable. He sobbed, he cried. And it says that once they saw how deeply it hurt their father, that Joseph could have been killed, by a wild animal, and knowing that they were lying about it, or at least not telling the truth, they were devastated as well. So, in spite of Joseph's family letting him down, Joseph remained faithful to God. And you know what? We can do that too. We can do that even if we think in this 21st century, we might be part of one of the most dysfunctional families around, because our function comes from God. And we need to understand that when there's trouble with family, God is our source of help. Secondly, Joseph faced trouble with work. Now, he didn't have a whole lot of work to do besides being the kid brother and maybe shepherding the flock and spending time with his dad. But once he was sold to the Midianites took him to Egypt. And they sold him to one of Pharaoh's officials. They sold him to a man named Potiphar. Now, the hand of God was sparing Joseph from certain death and was placing him in a strategic place of service in Egypt. Potiphar was the head of security for Pharaoh. He was the sheriff. He was the cop, the peacemaker. He was the one that had the force there to maintain security for Pharaoh and for Egypt. And then as Potiphar took Joseph into his home as a slave, as a servant, he observed that everything this new Hebrew servant was doing was being blessed with great success. He was impressed. And so, step by step, Joseph rose to prominence within Potiphar's personal home, and Potiphar continued to give him more things to do and continued to place more confidence upon him. He became the chief of the household servants, and then ultimately he became the manager of Potiphar's entire estate. Potiphar had that much confidence in this young man. He was really impressed, but so was someone else. And if you know the story, you know that the other person who was so impressed in Potiphar's household with Joseph was Potiphar's wife. And she liked what she saw. She saw this as an opportunity and a challenge that she was up for, and so she tried to seduce Joseph. And Joseph turned away. Joseph regularly rejected her advances for two very sound reasons. He said to her, "I cannot betray the trust of my master," meaning Potiphar. And then he said, "I cannot sin against God." And so no, we're not going to do what you would like us to do. No. Well, one day, she made arrangements so that she and Joseph were alone in the house, and she went to embrace him. And she tried to do her best to have him return that affection in kind. But Joseph fled from her presence, and as he ran away from her, she grabbed at his coat, and it came off, and all she had for all of her efforts was Joseph's coat. Now, this was not the coat of many colors. This was a different coat given to the household servant. And all she could do was scream. She screamed, and other servants came running. She held the coat out to them and said, "Look what I have in my hands." Joseph tried to rape me. Well, word got back to Potiphar, and Potiphar believed his wife's story. He ordered that Joseph be thrown into the royal prison, and in prison, Joseph was forgotten by Potiphar. It was kind of, that's the end of that. Someone betrays me like that, it's as though he doesn't live. And so the relationship was completely cut off. But Joseph was not forgotten by God. The Lord was with him, and the Lord blessed him. And once again, Joseph began to rise in rank and in leadership. The prison warden was so completely impressed by Joseph that he eventually made Joseph the chief administrator of the prison. He took a prisoner and placed his complete trust in that prisoner and who he was and what he did and the wisdom he used. That's quite amazing. And Joseph might have thought, "Hey, I've succeeded at last." But no, No, not quite. Joseph was still a prisoner. He was not free. And God still had something in store for him. So Joseph had to go through some more trouble before he found the blessing of God. He had trouble with friends. Now, two of Pharaoh's personal staff members were in prison with Joseph at the same time. One night, each of them had a dream. The next morning, Joseph could tell they were really frustrated, that they were perplexed. And he encouraged them to share their dreams because he said, dreams are up to God to interpret, and I can speak for God. And so the cupbearer to Pharaoh said that he dreamt that there were 3 large grape branches. He saw himself taking the grapes from that vine and squeezing them into Pharaoh's cup. And Joseph said, you know what that means? That means within 3 days, because of the 3 branches, you will again be restored as the cupbearer, the wine carrier to Pharaoh. And he was thrilled. He was thrilled. And encouraged by that positive attitude of the dream, Pharaoh's baker said, I had a dream too. But in my dream, I was carrying 3 baskets of baked goods. I was carrying them on my head, as you would see that done in many of the African countries. And birds flew down, and they ate the goods, the bread, the rolls, the delicacies that I had prepared, so that there was nothing left. Joseph said, well, I know what that means. That means in 3 days, you're going to be hanged. In 3 days, your life would be over, and the birds would eat your flesh. That's the kind of interpretation none of us would want to hear, but it's what Joseph had to say. Now, Joseph's interpretation of these dreams began a chain of events that would lead to yet another disappointment. In return for this interpretation that Joseph made for the cupbearer, he said, do me a favor. When you are restored to Pharaoh's house, when you are able to give him his wine again, would you remember who told you this would happen? Would you tell him about my plight? Would you let him know that I am an innocent man and have been serving years of time for something I did not do? And the cupbearer said, yes, absolutely. 3 days came around. And when 3 days came around, it happened to be Pharaoh's birthday. He had a big crowd in his palace. And so he said, let's do something. He went down or sent word to the warden and said, release my cupbearer and, release my baker. And they came into Pharaoh's presence in the midst of the crowd of the guests. And Pharaoh said that the cupbearer could live, but the baker would die. And that's what happened. It was almost like entertainment for them. Well, the cupbearer was so thankful for that. He got back his job. He got back his life. He was able to be with his family, and everything was fine. And he forgot about his promise to Joseph until something happened 2 years later. 2 years later, Pharaoh had a set of dreams. And he was so frustrated by those dreams, he couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep. He asked his own wise men, his own counsel, if they could interpret the dreams, and they had no idea what the dreams meant. And then it occurred to the cupbearer 2 years after he was released from prison that there's a man, a Hebrew man, who is still in that prison, and I've let him down. Pharaoh, he interpreted my dream, and he interpreted the baker's dream, and it came true. His God can interpret your dream too. And so immediately, Joseph was brought to the presence of Pharaoh, and the whole plan for saving not just Egypt, but the plan for saving Joseph's family, Jacob and all his brothers and his sisters and his nieces and nephews from a terrible, terrible plague, not a plague but a drought, would come true because God again used Joseph. Now, some would suggest that Joseph was in prison for 10 years before he met the cupbearer and the baker, and then he was forgotten. But in Joseph's story, we see in his life adversity piling on top of adversity. And what really matters most when we read that 26% of the book of Genesis on the life of Joseph, what matters most is not so much the events or the circumstances of life, but what matters most is how we respond to those circumstances, how we deal with adversity when it comes our way. With God's help, any situation can be used for good, even when others intend it for evil, if we turn ourselves over to God. Absolutely, we need to count on God's promises. And so, to have a strong adversity quotient, we need to realize that people are always going to disappoint us. And when that happens, we need to press on, because God is the one who can be trusted, even in the most difficult times. It's often in the most difficult disappointments that we realize God is with us, and God is developing in us an enduring faith in our hearts, in our minds, in our lives. And so, when adversity comes, when people double cross, when their promises are not kept, keep forgiving. Avoid becoming bitter or cynical, and put your total trust in the Lord by accepting His promises, which are so much better than the promises we receive from people around us. We are imperfect and we live among imperfect people, but we have a perfect God. And we need to follow Him no matter what. God will bless that. And He'll strengthen us from the inside out. Let's be like Joseph. Let's have the faith that God is going to stay true to His word, even when it seems like we're waiting. It hasn't happened yet. Come on, God. It's been years. I thought this was going to be weeks. But as we're faithful to Him, He is faithful to us. Would you tap that faith? Would you belong to Jesus? You find God's faithfulness in what He's accomplished for us through His Son. We invite you to Christ. We invite you to make that commitment. And if you need to follow Christ and obey Him and live for Him and be filled with His love and His Spirit, we invite you today to come forward as we sing this song. Let's stand. Let's sing.